I don't know about you, but I am in for a treat. We have James Clear in the house. James
Hey, Seth.
Clear, who sometimes, because he doesn't show up on 40 podcasts a week like other people seems a little bit like a specter and a ghost, but I got him. He's here, and we're going to take your questions. Um, so here's how it works. When you have a question, you post it in the comment section, and every once in a while, I put one on the screen. And I just want to thank James for coming. For those of you who don't know James Clear and Atomic Habits, you should sign off now because you've been living under a rock. For everybody else, the fact that it's the most important best-selling business book of the last bunch of decades, it says an enormous amount about James's empathy, his insight, and his understanding of strategy. How are you, sir?
Seth, good to see you. Thanks for making some time to chat.
Well, I made a list of all the people I wanted to interview who had a haircut just like mine, and you're
Yeah.
here first. So, congratulations.
That's great.
Okay, so let's just set the context here. Uh, you've written exactly one giant, humongous best-selling book, and you regularly, every week, share a newsletter that people can get for free called 123. I've been getting it for a very long time. It's super. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about the change you seek to make? What do you do when you're doing your work? Who's it for? What's it for?
We can look at it through a couple different lenses. Like first lens is why do I write about the stuff I write about? And that's mostly me following my personal interests. Am I excited about it? Do I need it? Like I mentioned to my publisher when I was working on Atomic Habits that writing this book is wrecking all of my personal habits. And I was kind of, complaining about it. And she said, well, we write the books we need. And
Yep.
I think at some level, pretty much everything I write about is a reminder to myself. It's the things that I need. And there's this funny thing when you write a book about habits, which is everybody assumes that your habits are dialed in, but like I'm struggling with it like everybody else, which is why I was interested in the first place. So that's kind of what draws me in. And then I think the second lens you could use to look at it is, um, what are you hoping to give to people? What are you hoping to contribute to your little, corner of humanity? And there are lots, habits have been written about for many, many years, and they'll be written about many years to come. And like my book is just one little piece of the overall pile of knowledge on the topic. But I hope that I can be the one that makes it actionable, that I can be the one that makes it practical. And so that's a big filter that I use for a lot of my writing is this something that people can actually apply? Does this make it easy to use and implement? And so there are better scientists than me, there are better journalists or writers than me, and like that's fine. My job is to try to make it actionable. And so I think those two things are kind of the main drivers of how I choose what to work on.
Beautiful. We're going to talk in a couple minutes about the new publishing model that you and I are using. But
Yeah.
first, I'm going to bring up a question from another author, someone who had a brilliant strategy for an entire industry. I don't know if you know Dane, but his book on wedding photography is not about wedding photography. And it's a must read for people who want to understand a go to market strategy. So, Dane has a question for you to get us started. What was the progression for you as you've thought about building the strategies and building the habits, given that you focused, you read your book more closely than anybody else?
Yeah. Um, there are a couple different filters that I go through, thinking about this. Like one filter is what is upstream of other good things happening, so it's basically a sequencing problem. And there are a couple examples of how this played out. Like one example is I decided to build my author career by building an audience before I had the book. So I wrote for 3 years on jamesclear.com and built up an email list of hundreds of thousands of people there. Um, before the book came out anywhere. And that audience is what got me into the room. Like the publishers in New York never would have met with me if I didn't have the email list. Like that was what, if you would have asked them, they would have said, oh, we're looking for a book on habits or we're excited about the topic. But what they really meant was you have a large following and that's the reason we're meeting with you. And so that's an example of, building an email list or building an audience was upstream of other good things happening. And it's not just things like getting a book deal, like building an audience can do a lot of good things for you. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to focus on that first. So that was a big part of my strategy. Another example, when it came time to sign the book deal for Atomic Habits, I was strategizing about, should I self-publish? Should I traditional publish? Seth, actually, I came to your office and we had a very helpful meeting right around that time when I was putting the book proposal together. And so anyway, the punchline of this is that ultimately at the time, this is around 2015 is when I signed the book deal, 2018 is when it came out. But around that time, there were basically no self-published books on the bestseller list. It was like kind of impossible to get it. And it's still hard now to do it, but at least it has been done a couple times. And so I thought, well, if I can hit the New York Times list once, then I'll be a New York Times bestselling author for the rest of my career. And so that's a choice that is upstream from a lot of that little bit of credibility could help me for the next 40 years.
Yep.
But if I self-publish the next 10 books and then I traditionally publish in 30 years, I kind of lost like that credibility marker for a big portion of the career. So I decided to go with the traditional model, not exclusively for that reason, but that's like one example of thinking about the sequencing and trying to get all of that right. So those are a couple of the things that I
That's a great riff. So I'm going to interject, so in the new book, I have the idea that when you pick your customers, you pick your future. And there are a lot of hardworking authors who are waiting for a book publisher to discover them and make them well known. And that worked for J.D. Salinger, but it hasn't worked very well since then. And when you chose to say there are going to be 100,000, 1 million people who want to hear from me every week, you had to write for them. You did not have to write for an editor who didn't like your work. You didn't have to write for all the middlemen. You didn't have to please an agent. You had to please those people. Once you please the people you seek to help, then the door opens for you to amplify the work. All right, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how this book came to be and what you've been up to. So this came out today, and the idea of author's equity, and I proudly am the first person to have a book with their logo on it, is it sounds mechanical. It's you don't get paid in advance, but you get a bigger royalty. But that's not really what it's about, because in book publishing, the advance has traditionally been the way the publisher indicates to the author their eagerness to publish somebody. It's like duplicate bridge, how much you're bidding. And what happens once you're above we'll take this book, but we don't know what to do with it, is you look at that advance and you can't help but emotionally feel like the publisher is your client. And as an author, you spend a lot of time trying to make the publisher happy because they paid for it. But in fact, that gets in the way.
Or fearing that they will be unhappy.
Yes, right? Exactly. That gets in the way of the book, and it gets in the way of your readers, and it gets in the way of your soul. And so switching to author's equity, in addition to the astonishing human beings I got to work with, is I never one day thought they were my client. I knew they were my partner. And since they were my partner, the dance we did together is different, and the book is different as a result. So along the way, I discovered that you are the founding author / whatever, fly on the wall. So tell me how you came to the Authors Equity Circle and what you're excited about there.
Sure. So Matt Lynn, the CEO of Authors Equity, was previously CEO of Penguin, and Penguin published Atomic Habits. So we came to know each other through that experience. And there were a lot of things about the traditional model that I didn't like or wanted to push, to be different. And yeah, we had lots of conversations about that, I think is the short version. And when she decided to leave and start this venture, I was one of the first authors that she talked to about it. And there's just a lot of alignment there in our thinking. And I think there are many things we could say about the model, but my shorthand version is traditional publishing is short-term friendly to authors. We'll give you money up front, but long-term unfriendly. We'll keep all the money on the back end, and the incentives are not totally aligned. And we're trying to create a model that is long-term friendly to authors, where the incentives are aligned, the creative rights are aligned, the author has more control of the process. And as you said, there are a lot of other nice things that happen naturally, like the author feels like they're writing for the audience more, and not necessarily the publisher. And I actually think that's a very important point that you brought up a minute ago, Seth. You mentioned it just for me and kind of my writing, that I wasn't writing for an editor. I was writing for the audience when I was building the email list, and also for your own, this book, This is Strategy, like kind of how that process was different. But there are a lot of very smart editors in publishing, and it's really valuable to have their feedback. But at the end of the day, it is still only one person. And what really matters is not whether that one person likes or dislikes the book. It's, does the audience as a whole, does the community you're trying to reach and deliver something that is valuable and generous, do those people care and enjoy it and find value in it? And so you're not actually looking for a story, which is what the editor can give you about why this is or isn't working. You're looking for a pattern amongst 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 people of why they like it and why it's valuable. And I think that's one of the big advantages of building an audience first, is that you have to do the hard work of figuring out some of those patterns of which pieces of content are resonating and where people are finding value. But hopefully the author's equity model helps authors stay on that track a little bit more.
And, Madeline and I have been having strategy conversations, usually unprompted on her part, because I can't help myself. Because publishing is fascinating because of the constraints. And that's what's always brought me to it. If you're writing a business book, it's very unlikely you have color illustrations. It's super unlikely you have videos inside. The book has pages, that's what you get, right? That you can sell it in this kind of store, but you can't sell in that kind of store. It would be fantastic if there were big piles of our book at Costco. There isn't. And these constraints help us understand what is possible. So the constraints aren't a problem, they're the point. But when you start a new publishing company, a whole bunch of things that the old industry takes for granted because they've been around for centuries, you don't have to do. And so one of them is, let's dispense with this whole idea of advances. But there are other ones about distribution and holding a book hostage to make sure it goes through the bestseller list, as opposed to just letting people get it directly from you. And what formats and how are you going? I've got a blog post going up in an hour about how unfair Audible is becoming to authors and to the people they said they were founded to create. My wife used to be the general counsel at Audible, so I had a first row seat at its development. Don, the CEO, is an author, and he's written a bunch of books. But what's happened over the years, as Audible has become more and more of an Amazon monopoly, is the amount control, follow-up, and equity that goes to the author has gone down dramatically. And Cory Doctorow has written about this brilliantly. So I just put the new book on a totally different kind of platform, because let's find out. And this whole idea of let's find out is really important if you're exploring strategy. So speaking of that, because we're not going to be here all day, I want to make sure I leave enough time. When we were hanging out the other day, you told me about this project that you've been doing quietly in the background, where you're helping authors basically with the strategy of the book before they write it. Do you want to lean in? I can't remember what you called it, but it has a great name.
Yeah, so it's basically an imprint inside of Authors Equity, but the program, which I'm calling First Draft, there are lots of resources for authors to help figure out how to write their book well. You can have an editor, you can go through various drafts. There's a whole machinery and apparatus to try to improve the content of the book. But there isn't nearly as much discussion, or I think there really isn't any discussion about the positioning of the book. Usually the positioning is already figured out. Maybe it's happening between agents and authors before the proposal is put together or whatever, but like it's already kind of over by the time it gets to the publisher. And I would say these are all just, made up numbers, but just if we're looking for a rule of thumb or a guideline, I'd say like 50% of the success of a book is nailing the positioning. And then the other 50% is like 1,000 things that all have to be done well together. And collectively they add up to a lot. But the example I always give is there's a chapter later in Atomic Habits where I talk about deliberate practice. Now, it could have been a book about deliberate practice where I talked about habits, but instead it's a book about habits where I talk about deliberate practice. And I think the difference in how those two books would sell is enormous, because I don't really need to convince anybody to have good habits or break bad ones. Like just by virtue of growing up in society, it's something you already want. What I need to convince you of is, hey, if you're only going to read one book on the topic, this is the one to read. And deliberate practice, if you don't know what it is, it takes 30 seconds to unpack it, and you got to kind of explain it. And you don't get that as an author. You need the book to sell itself in 3 seconds just by looking at the cover. And so from a strategy standpoint, one of the big questions I try to work on with authors is, first, what is the insatiable desire that already exists that your book is addressing? So like at a population level, building good habits and breaking bad ones is an insatiable desire. It will never be satisfied. It will always be present, and it already exists. I don't have to create it or convince the audience, hey, you should care about this.
Yep.
So, there are 30, 40, 50 things that are kind of like that in the nonfiction space. And you want to be tapping into one of those in some way, something, at least something adjacent to that. Like building a successful business it is an insatiable desire that is already there. And this is strategy taps into that in some way. So, that's the first thing. And then the second thing that we work on a lot is, what is the element of contrast or surprise in this title or in this book that catches people's attention and gives them a reason to think about it? So like I was talking with Neil deGrasse Tyson last week, and his best-selling book is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. And it's the contrast of astrophysics sounds like something that you need 7 years and a PhD to understand. And he's like, no, actually, you just need to read this book for 2 hours. And that element of surprise or contrast is very catchy and, helps the positioning of the book. The content could be the same. The pages could be the same. But if the positioning is better, then if the strategy is better, then the outcome is dramatically different. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing with authors are things like that, trying to figure out how do we nail the positioning for this book so that all the hard work and effort that you put into the ideas is, fully realized rather than, just kind of falls flat.
Yeah. And I'm such a big fan of all these things. There's a whole section of the book about insatiable desires. I think that insatiable desires can be more broad, and then there are flavors within them that people. So the biggest insatiable desires are convenience, status, affiliation, survival, thriving. But within those, we find these lanes where people say, yes, I need that. I think that one of the things that comes through in the title of Atomic Habits, but also in the title of books that aren't on the nose nonfiction, like To Kill a Mockingbird, is confidence. That when we seek out a book, we're often seeking a book that is going to answer our question, not be one of 40 choices, right? So romance novels don't try to be the definitive romance novel. They're like popcorn. You just keep eating romance novels. But if you can show up with confidence and say, I've done the work, I've done the research here, then I think something is being communicated.
That's a really good point. And there's a lot of different ways that can happen throughout a book. And like, I think this is something that a good table of contents really does well. If you put yourself in the lens of someone who's like, oh yeah, I kind of need to like stop doing that habit, or I need to, I wish I could like stick to this new habit. And if you look at the cover of Atomic Habits, you're like, okay, I see why they would be interested. And then if you look through the table of contents, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to figure out how each chapter title could address the main pain points or the main desires that people have related to building habits. And if you read through that list of chapter titles and you imagine yourself in the seat of someone who wants to build a habit or break a bad one, you're like, damn, I have to read this book now. Like it's addressing all those little individual lanes that people have.
It's
and I think
beautifully crafted.
From a bigger picture strategy standpoint, you could say, okay, take whatever you want, whether it's writing a book or building a business or whatever the project is that you're excited about. What is that big insatiable desire that we're trying to address? And then what are all the little, individual obstacles that people face, the little pain points? List them all out. Everything that can be both negative. So what are all the things that prevent people from getting this big thing they want? And then it can also be positive. What are all the desires, the hopes, the wishes, the dreams that people have about this topic? And you write them all out, and then you try to figure out how can we address each one of these, or maybe you rank them, and try to figure out what are the most important ones. And if you can put a product together, whether it's a book or an audio course or, a piece of software or whatever, that addresses like 10 or 15 or 20 of those big pain points. I mean, it's so rare that someone would put that level of thought and effort into it that you almost can't help but stand out.
And I'm going to add one more thing, and then we got one more question. The first 10,000 books are the hardest to sell because that's the author's job. The next 30,000 books are the book's job, in the sense that, did the book touch those first 10,000 people in a way that causes them to talk about it? And in your case, the next 14 million copies, or whatever the number is, happen because someone who hasn't even touched the book knows they need to, because the book itself has created the conditions in the culture where, if you want to be people like us, you have to be informed. And it's very easy to try to reverse engineer this process. But what I think you're highlighting for us, James, is the craftsmanship and effort you put into it. You didn't do it in 4 weeks. That every sentence, every paragraph, every page is purpose built the same way an engineer would build a building to do what it's supposed to do, which is I think, okay segue into Catherine's question. I'll let you go first.
Let's see. Can you use AI to help, one, position, and two, pick a title for your book? Sure, you can use it. There's not, I mean, there's no, there are no rules. There's no reason you can't use it. I think positioning is tricky, and it's probably not going to be the type of thing that, Chat GPT is just going to spit out fully formed for you. Like it requires lots of iteration and thought. I mean, it just as an example of a couple things that I did when I was working on my title. First, I brainstormed everything I could think of. So I have a spreadsheet of it was between 300 and 400 titles that I brainstormed, potential titles for Atomic Habits. Now, a lot of them were no good. They were just like a brainstorm that was leading to the next one, but even of that 300, like maybe there's 50 in there that I'm like, oh, I kind of liked those. And then you start to whittle them down. And eventually we started testing the ones that we thought were best, or I thought were best. So, I tested them. There's a service called PickFu where you can put together polls. And so my favorite poll is, I just write which of these two titles is more appealing. And then I put in an A option and a B option. And you can limit the audience that sees it to, like, I usually do people between the ages of 18 and 54 who live in the United States and are Amazon Prime customers. And so those people pick which one they like more. Now you got to pay for this, right? It might cost you $100 or $200 to put the poll together, but you get some actual feedback from real people. And then I ran some sliding forms on my site where I put together like a mock-up cover of the title. And it was just the form would slide out and it'd be a picture of the cover and then a little button that you would click on to say, like, click here to learn more. And the page that you got to was just a newsletter page where it said, hey, I'm working on my next book, enter your email here to learn more about when it launches. But the sliding forms it was the split testing different versions. And anyway, what ended up happening was there were maybe 7 titles that were all kind of roughly similar. They weren't, one would win on PickFu and a different one would win in the sliding form. And so at some point it becomes an artistic decision. You have to decide, how do I want to show up in the world? What am I trying to be seen as? I also didn't want to come across too clickbaity. I'm not trying to be like an internet marketer. I'm trying to be an expert on habits and, a thought leader in this industry. And so there are certain angles that you need to consider there as well, even if the data maybe says something slightly different. So all of that to say, I think AI could be great for generating options and giving you raw material to build off of, but it's very hard for AI is only going to spit out things based on the inputs that you put in. And at some point it becomes about discernment and judgment. And that is a very human process. So the inputs are controlled by you and the judgment is controlled by you. And AI can help generate options, but it's still going to be a human choice.
Well said. Here's my method. First of all, ChatGPT is lazy and annoying and arrogant. I'm a Claude.ai person through and through. Claude and I get along great. Here's the way that I would do it. I would write up a page and a half where you define what you mean by positioning and explain the positioning of some successful books in your own language to teach Claude what your question even means. And then I would suggest 20 titles. And I would say to Claude, please read my understanding of positioning. please look at the 20 titles I have in mind and also read the first 20 pages of my book. Now, I would like you to describe to me the position of the book and suggest 40 more titles. And when you do that, it will surprise you. I have never not been surprised by what it did. Half of what it gives you will be complete and utter garbage. And the other half, you're going to say, I bet I can use that and I don't even have to tell anyone he thought of it. And this idea that you have a patient, semi-dumb brainstorming partner who will tirelessly respond to you playing ping pong, you can't become a world-class ping pong player playing against the wall, but you can get a lot better if you play against the wall for a long time. So I wrote every word of my book, but I will tell you that there's a bunch of times when I said, here's my list of 5 things. Which 2 did I leave out? And it would read the chapter and it would say, maybe you should think of this or that. And sometimes it was like, oh yeah, I should have thought of this or that. And I think if you're not doing that, and even if you're discarding everything it says, if you're not doing that, I don't think you're using all the tools that are available to you right this minute.
I don't use AI a ton in my process, but I will say that I have found it helpful if it's like further upstream in the process. In other words, like, let's say that I want to start a chapter off with like a story about an airline crash. I could say like, tell me about 10 of the most famous airline crashes or whatever. And there's like 7 on there that I had never heard of. And so then that gives me, new material to go research. It's good for unearthing things that maybe you hadn't heard about before. Or if you're thinking about the positioning question, I think one really good positioning question for books is, can you name 2, 3, 4 other books that have already sold 1 million copies in this category? Because that proves that the category already exists, that there is actually an appetite for books like that. And so you could go to the AI and say, hey, can you give me 5 titles that have, sold over 100,000 copies on this? And they'll probably give you some that you hadn't heard about before. And then that lets you go research their marketing and their positioning. And, it kind of goes from there. But it can be nice for generating options that would otherwise not come across your radar.
Beautiful. All right. Well, we are all eagerly looking forward to your next thing. Don't rush it. Make it as magical as you can. And I appreciate you taking the time to tune in. Today's launch day for me, so I am completely exhausted. I think I am entitled to a 20-minute nap, which might happen next. But first, I'm going to eat some collectible chocolate. James, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Keep making a ruckus.